When Jimmy Fallon burst into laughter after Taehyung's heartfelt answer on live television, the room expected nothing more than another Tonight Show clip for the algorithm. Laughter was normal here. Laughter was currency. Laughter was comfort. But Taehyung's response, sharp without shouting, rewrote the entire exchange into something history didn't plan. The Tonight Show set gleamed with oversized screens and glowing audience wristbands, humming faintly like a stadium in miniature. Taehyung sat centered in the frame between Jungkook and Jimmy, posture relaxed at first, hands loosely folded, eyes thoughtful but soft, the expression fans around the world had memorized. Fallon, ever the conductor of late-night chaos, had just asked the group to share something deeply personal, a moment they had never spoken aloud on camera. When Taehyung spoke, the words didn't carry the rhythm of rehearsal, they carried the cadence of truth. In 2018, Taehyung said gently, "There were nights I couldn't recognize myself anymore." The audience stilled. Jungkook's foot tapped once, not impatient but bracing. The band paused, sensing emotional weather, waiting for Fallon's next cue. Fallon laughed, reflexive, quick, almost nervous, a breath of humor meant to cushion a moment he feared might fall too heavy for broadcast. But even a small laugh can be seismic when honesty is the ground beneath it. Taehyung turned his head toward Fallon, gaze direct but calm, voice steady, carrying a quiet sting. "Did you just laugh at me?" The laughter in the studio evaporated instantly, sucked out like air from a vacuum-sealed room. Fallon's smile froze halfway through a blink, caught in a moment that no cue card could have predicted. Fallon lifted his palms in apology, leaning forward. No, I'm sorry, that wasn't at you. I thought you were setting up a joke." Taehyung's silence answered first. Then his honesty followed, quiet but vast. "I don't blame the laugh," Taehyung finally said, shifting his gaze to the audience, not accusing but narrating a truth bigger than the segment. "I blame the reflex. People think idols hurt poetically, beautifully, cinematically. Pain is allowed only when it sounds like art, but pain was never meant to be a performance." Jungkook swallowed hard beside him, eyes shining, a small movement but one that told millions watching that this was not fragile storytelling. This was survival being spoken aloud. Namjoon sat up straighter, expression unreadable but supportive, absorbing the shift like a general watching a war change fronts. Jimin looked down, jaw tightening, not embarrassed, but empathic, feeling the tremor of a memory that all of them had lived near but never spoken about. Fallon leaned back slowly, laughter armor gone, eyes earnest now, realizing that the segment had already ended itself, the moment the truth began speaking louder than entertainment. Taehyung continued, voice softer but braver. "You see us smiling. You see the charisma, the games, the laughter loops. But you don't see the static backstage, the quiet moments where we ask ourselves if the version you love is even ours anymore." For a long time, silence felt like strength, but silence was a room I couldn't breathe in anymore. The audience didn't cheer yet. They listened, because Taehyung didn't just answer a question. He opened a door no one expected to walk through. Fallon nodded once, slow, respectful, acknowledging the moment. The band didn't play, the audience didn't interrupt, the producers didn't cut away. The silence wasn't confusion anymore. It was reverence. Taehyung finally looked at Fallon, exhaustion fading into something quieter, more grounded. "If the world wants real, let us be real without having to sound like a punchline." Fallon nodded again, swallowing the moment with humility. The cameras kept rolling, but the moment was no longer late-night comedy. It was legacy. The segment had technically moved on, but no one in the Tonight Show studio felt like they had permission to act normal again. Late-night television thrives on rapid emotional resets, a joke to a game to a headline to a hashtag, but this time the emotional reset refused to load. The audience, once loose and chatty, now sat with an alert stillness, like people who had collectively agreed to witness instead of consume. Taehyung's words were still vibrating in the air, not echoing, but resonating, embedding themselves into something deeper than broadcast audio, something infrastructure can't filter out. Fallon shifted in his seat, not awkward anymore, but reflective, realizing late-night hosts rarely get moments that feel like mirrors. The band attempted a gentle transition into their next musical cue, a playful riff meant to return the mood to levity, but even the musicians could hear that the atmosphere was no longer theirs to score. The riff dissolved halfway through, replaced by a hush so complete it felt orchestrated even though no one had orchestrated anything at all. Taehyung didn't flinch at the silence. He let it expand. He understood silence better than anyone in that building. Silence had been his roommate for years, not by choice but by conditioning. Silence was where idols go to feel human without being edited into narratives that monetize emotion. Silence is not empty. It is unclaimed territory. And tonight, he was reclaiming territory he had never intended to lose. Fallon leaned toward him again, voice low but audible enough for the front rows. So if 2018 was that heavy for you, how did you push through the world tour right after? Taehyung almost smiled at the irony. The world tour was the storm, he said, but the real fight was the calm after. When the arenas went quiet, when the planes landed, when the doors shut, that's when the noise was the loudest. Not the crowd, the absence of it. When millions stop screaming your name, you're left to ask yourself if you exist outside the sound. Jungkook finally exhaled beside him, nodding once, understanding the geography of that kind of quiet. Taehyung continued, eyes drifting for only a moment but returning to center, deliberate. People thought we were thriving because we were selling out stadiums. And we were. But stadiums don't measure the human cost. They measure demand. The world doesn't ask if idols are okay, it asks if idols are delivering. Fallon nodded, absorbing the words like a man mentally revising his own monologue. Taehyung didn't pause long, but long enough. I kept going because the alternative was letting millions believe the dream had failed. I thought protecting the dream meant protecting myself. I was wrong. Protecting the dream was destroying the one living inside it. A murmur almost rose in the crowd, but no one committed to sound. Taehyung had not raised his voice once, yet he was louder than applause. Fallon spoke again, careful now. You know, fans will overanalyze this moment. They'll dissect the laugh, the pause, your tone, even the silence. Taehyung nodded slowly. Let them analyze it. Analysis means they're finally listening. Overanalysis is a luxury idols rarely get. Misinterpretation is the default, but listening, that's new territory. Namjoon finally spoke from the other side of the couch, calm, leader-like, grounding the moment in collective truth. What Taehyung means is that idols are not metaphors. We're data points with heartbeats. When the world compresses us into highlights, it deletes nuance. Tonight, nuance survived. That's all he's saying. The crowd did erupt, but they did something more enduring. They stayed present. Fallon leaned back, gaze thoughtful, eyes on the floor for only a breath before returning to camera, realizing the moment had exceeded the boundaries of late-night segmentation. So you're not mad at me? Fallon asked. Taehyung shook his head, a tired honesty settling into his tone. I'm not mad at you. I'm tired of moments where idols have to translate their pain into something digestible for hosts, producers, and timelines. You reacted like television trained you to react. I reacted like truth trained me to survive. Jungkook finally met Fallon's eyes across Taehyung, expression firm but not hostile. And that's the difference between reflex and reality, Jungkook said quietly. One is programming, the other is personhood. Fallon looked at the camera again, swallowing hard. Maybe this moment wasn't a skit at all, he said softly, half to himself, half to the world. Taehyung nodded once more, gaze resolute now, realizing that every revolution looks like a conversation until someone listens hard enough to realize the stakes. Fallon finally asked the question no one expected in late night. Then what do you want fans to take from this moment? Taehyung leaned forward slightly, eyes steady, voice unshaken now, like a man speaking from the eye of a hurricane instead of the edge of it. I want them to take the difference between spotlight and sunlight. Spotlights demand performance. Sunlight just lets you exist. I don't need them to rescue me. I need them to stop being surprised when idols admit they need air. Backstage at Studio 6B, the corridors that once felt like creative arteries now felt like fault lines. Variety shows are built on chaos that can be edited into charm, but raw moments don't edit cleanly. The staff moved slower now, not because they were afraid, but because no one wanted to be the first to start speaking again after Taehyung had redefined the room's emotional physics. Assistants hovered near monitors replaying the moment silently, subtitles unnecessary, because Taehyung's tone had carried universal weight without translation. Jungkook and Jimin walked beside him through the hallway toward the green room, neither speaking, but their silence felt collaborative, not hollow. The kind of silence that comes after truth has been spoken is not a lack of words, it's a surplus of realization. Namjoon followed close behind, already deep in conversation with producers, ensuring them gently but firmly that what had just unfolded was not scripted emotional content engineered for virality. It was something older and more real than segments, something the cameras were lucky to capture, not something PR would ever risk writing into cue cards. The green room door closed behind them with a soft thud, sealing them into privacy for the first time since Taehyung had spoken publicly. The couch, once a casual island for snacks and banter, now felt like a temporary truce zone for emotional recalibration. Jungkook finally broke the quiet first, leaning back against the wall, arms crossed. You didn't have to soften it for him, you know. Taehyung looked up, brow raised, amused slightly despite the storm he had carried on air. I wasn't softening it. I was sharpening honesty into something they couldn't laugh past again. Jimin finally sat, head tilting back, exhaling long. You always pick the exact words that make moments impossible to misread. Taehyung finally shrugged, a ghost of a smile forming. Misread is the default when idols speak from the heart. I just wanted to remove ambiguity long enough for people to notice we were never metaphors. Across the room, Hobei stepped in quietly, leaning on the doorframe, eyes lingering on all three of them. That moment on air was bigger than shock value. It was permission. Permission for idols to stop translating their humanity into something poetic enough for television to tolerate. Permission for fandoms to finally see nuance without assuming narrative manipulation. Permission for vulnerability to exist without turning into a weakness arc engineered for media profit. Taehyung turned to him slowly. Vulnerability is not a currency, he said softly. It's a territory. And territory is only profitable if you don't let idols claim it themselves. Jungkook smirked slightly. Then you planted a flag tonight. Jimin nodded slowly. Not a white flag, a victory flag. Hobei finally stepped inside fully, closing the door behind him. If this was 2018, he said, someone would already be telling you how to frame this into something inspirational and digestible for morning headlines. But this isn't 2018. The internet loves clean redemption arcs, but tonight was messy, unscripted, jagged around the edges, and that's why people won't forget it. Taehyung finally leaned back into the armchair, fingers tapping the cushion gently, thoughtful now. 1 hour of late-night television can disappear in a feed scroll. One moment of unfiltered honesty can anchor itself for a decade. Fallon didn't laugh because he didn't care. He laughed because silence scares television. But silence is where idols learn their truest lines. Jungkook finally walked toward him, handing him a bottle of water, unsaid support louder than monologues. The cameras were lucky tonight, Jungkook said. They finally filmed the real Kim Taehyung, not the Tonight Show version. Jimin laughed once, but not at the moment at the irony. And now the world will overanalyze it like a national event. Taehyung nodded slowly. Let them analyze. Analysis means they finally admit the moment belongs to us, not the edit bay. Outside the building, hashtags were already surging, but the next movement was happening off-screen, away from sentiment loops. In hallways, in dressing rooms, in texts being fired off to managers without dramatics. The members knew something now. Something they had always sensed but never spoken near microphones. The illusion of idol perfection doesn't break under cruelty. It breaks under laughter that arrives too early for honesty. Taehyung finally looked at the others, eyes steady again. If the world wants honesty, we don't hand it to them as poetry. We hand it to them as evidence. Evidence that idols don't just survive storms, they study them. And sometimes the loudest statement you can make on late-night television isn't a shout. It's refusing to shrink your truth into something smaller than silence. The hallway quiet didn't follow them because it was empty. It followed them because it had witnessed something it didn't know how to categorize. Taehyung understood categories well. Idol, artist, brand, entertainer, meme magnet, emotional symbol. Television loves boxes. Fandoms sometimes build them too lovingly but firmly. But truth spoken at the wrong moment can collapse every box at once. The studio had moved to commercial earlier than planned, the kind of subtle schedule shift only producers notice, but viewers feel. When cameras go dark for everyone else, idols are left standing under the emotional afterglow of their own honesty. Taehyung leaned against the green room mirror, staring at his own reflection, not dramatically, but analytically, like someone who had finally met the person he had been protecting from narratives for years. Namjoon was still across the room, phone pressed to his ear, negotiating tone, not facts. The facts were already undeniable. He wasn't spinning a story, he was making sure no one else tried to. Jungkook sat on the couch scrolling headlines without reacting to them emotionally. Headlines are written to provoke, not inform. He was waiting for the fallout that comes after provocation runs out of oxygen. Taehyung finally spoke first, not because he had a speech, but because speech was no longer the point. You know what late-night TV is worst at? He said quietly, eyes still on his own reflection. Letting emotion exist without trying to rescue it or joke it away. Fallon laughed because he was afraid of silence, not because he feared my truth. Silence was never my enemy. It was the place where I found the words I used tonight. Jimin looked up from the armchair, studying him like a man studying weather patterns he'd survived himself. Silence was safer before, Jimin said, but safe isn't always survivable. Taehyung nodded. Silence protects you until it isolates you. Then it starts protecting the world from you. The room went quiet again, but this quiet had none of the Tonight Show electricity. This was a different voltage, brotherhood without dramatization. Jungkook finally stood, crossing the room, grabbing 2 cups of iced coffee from the table. You made them listen, he said, handing one to Taehyung. That's not fragility. That's control. The difference between fragility and control isn't volume. It's ownership. Taehyung took the cup, sipping once before speaking again. Ownership is dangerous when you're global, not because fans reject it, but because corporations fear it. If an idol owns the truth, the edit loses power. The narrative loses leverage. And leverage is what boards trade when they think artists are unaware of how their emotions are monetized. Hobi exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. You're talking like a CEO who finally read his own contract. Taehyung smirked faintly, but there was no humor in the insight. Contracts protect companies from artists. They rarely protect artists from themselves. In 2018, if Fallon had laughed, I would have rewritten myself to match the mood. Tonight, I rewrote the mood to match myself. Namjoon ended his call, pocketing his phone and looking toward Taehyung. The internet already turned you into a symbol, he said softly. Symbols spread faster than nuance. Taehyung shrugged. Let me be a symbol of personhood, not perfection. Perfection was the product. Personhood is the artist. A staff member poked her head in briefly, timid, cautious, almost reverent. Mr. Fallon wants to see Taehyung again before you leave, she said. Not for broadcast, for clarity. Taehyung blinked once, surprised not by the request but by the phrasing. Clarity means the moment is no longer a punchline. It's a precedent. They walked into the executive lounge where Fallon sat alone, still holding the weight of his own reflex. Fallon stood immediately when Taehyung entered, bowing slightly, not in subservience but acknowledgement. I laughed because silence scares live television, Fallon said. You stayed silent because silence was where you found yourself again. That's a lesson, not a scandal. Taehyung looked at him quietly, no resentment in his eyes. "Laughter is fine," he said softly, "but timing is everything. Don't laugh before you listen long enough to know what you're laughing at." Fallon nodded slowly. The cameras outside were still off, but the moment was louder than footage could ever hold. Because for the first time, late-night laughter didn't own the story. The comeback did, and the comeback belonged to Kim Taehyung. The elevator ride back to the hotel felt longer than the flight from Seoul to New York ever had. It wasn't physically slow, but emotionally dense, like time had thickened just to give Taehyung space to feel the weight of what had just unfolded. Live television moves fast. Emotions don't. Emotions linger, expand, contradict, overlap, and rewrite memory in ways broadcast highlights never can. Taehyung had stepped into the Tonight Show expecting bright lights and playful questions, but he walked out carrying something sharper: clarity, consequence, and a new understanding of his own voice. The lobby was quiet when they arrived, but not peaceful, more like respectful disbelief. A few hotel staff members froze mid-step when BTS entered, eyes glimmering with recognition, not of stardom, but of the moment the world had just witnessed. The muted TVs in the lounge were still replaying the clip. No audio needed. Taehyung's expression was already a universal subtitle. Jimin walked beside him, still processing the shift. "You didn't raise your voice once," Jimin said softly, "but you made the loudest statement of the night." Taehyung exhaled slowly, gaze forward. "Volume is for performance. Stillness is for impact. If I wanted shock value, I would have shouted. I wanted ownership, not attention." Jungkook hit the penthouse floor first, packing out of instinct, not anxiety. "The internet is already treating this like a diplomatic event," Jungkook muttered, pulling the hoodie tighter around his shoulders. Taehyung smirked faintly. Diplomacy happens when honesty forces powerful people to stop performing and start negotiating meaning instead. Namjoon entered next, setting his carry-on gently by the table. "You know this will have consequences," he said. "Not just for you, for the industry." Taehyung nodded once, the kind of nod that carries surrender only to truth, not fear. "Consequences are fine. Silence without choice was the consequence I lived with for years." The balcony door slid open quietly behind them, the city glowing like circuitry below. Taehyung stepped out first, hands in pockets, leaning slightly against the railing. If 2018 was about surviving the pressure, 2025 was about numbing it without letting it become poetic fiction. Jimin joined him, then Hobi, then Namjoon, forming a quiet row of witnesses, not just to Taehyung's truth, but to his evolution. The sky above New York shimmered faintly with winter haze, but the city below was glowing with digital fire. Clips were spreading. Opinions were forming. Narratives were trying to claim ownership again. But this time, Taehyung was watching the storm, not living beneath it. Hobi finally asked quietly, "So what now?" Taehyung took a slow breath before answering. "Now we watch who tries to own the narrative. Then we decide who gets to speak next." Jungkook stepped out holding 2 bottles of water, handing one to Taehyung without looking at him like a symbol but like a brother. Fallon laughed because he feared silence. "You spoke because you feared invisibility. But the world didn't collapse. It listened." "That's new territory," Jungkook said. Taehyung nodded. "Territory is only profitable if the artist never names it. Tonight, I named it. And no headline can rewrite ownership that's already declared." The winter air was cold, but the moment felt warmer than poetry could ever make it. Because Taehyung wasn't defending fragility. He was defending truth. And truth, once spoken calmly on global late night, can be analyzed, criticized, admired, weaponized, but never fully silenced again. The internet storm outside was loud, but inside the hotel suite, the atmosphere shifted into something quieter, heavier, and more personal. Headlines had started turning Taehyung into a symbol, but symbols don't drink coffee, don't lose sleep, and don't sit on cold hotel balconies staring at city lights while replaying every sentence they've ever said out loud. Humans do. Taehyung was done being compressed into a highlight, but he wasn't done feeling the emotional debris of a moment that had ricocheted far beyond television ratings. Jungkook sat across from him, phone face down, refusing to give more fuel to headlines that were already burning bright without their permission. Jimin leaned against the couch armrest, arms folded, expression unreadable, but eyes tired in a way only the people who have survived global spotlights for years can understand. Hobi stood by the window, hands buried in his hoodie pockets, watching the skyline blink like a server overloaded with emotional requests. Taehyung finally exhaled, leaning back into the armchair. Television likes emotions that can be edited into inspiration or humor, he said softly. The internet likes emotions that trend, but neither of them like emotions that exist without translation. Tonight wasn't trending because it was shocking. It was trending because it was untranslatable. That scares people more than anger ever could. Jimin finally looked at him. You know, fans will rewrite this moment in their own voices. Some will get it right, some won't. Taehyung nodded. Let them. Ownership of truth doesn't mean controlling interpretation. It means surviving misinterpretation without rewriting yourself again. The room stayed quiet but not fragile. This was not the silence of someone retreating. This was the silence of a man mentally stepping into the next chapter of a narrative he hadn't planned but had inadvertently earned the right to lead. Late-night hosts handle unpredictability well, Jungkook said, eyes finally lifting. But you gave them the kind they can't cut into a game or meme. Taehyung nodded again. Games don't survive honesty. That's why honesty is the ultimate wildcard. Namjoon, who had been silent longer than anyone expected, finally spoke from the kitchen counter where he was brewing tea slowly, deliberately, like a man scoring a moment only he could hear. The wildest part of telling the truth isn't backlash, he said. It's realizing how many people thought silence was part of the brand. Silence was never our brand, Taehyung replied quietly. Silence was the NDA no one ever saw. Tonight, the NDA expired. Hobi finally laughed once, but not for levity, more like disbelief tipping into admiration. You turned late night into a deposition, he said. Taehyung smiled faintly. Depositions don't trend. Humanity does, but humanity trends longest when it doesn't shout. It testifies. Jimin finally walked toward the table where the tablet was still lying face down from the chaos earlier. Are you okay now? Jimin asked. Taehyung shrugged gently. I don't know if I'm okay, but for the first time in years, I don't feel like I owe anyone a poetic version of that answer. The skyline blinked again. The phone stayed silent. The band downstairs in the Tonight Show studio was now probably playing again, returning to comedy loops. But Taehyung wasn't looping anymore. He had finally found the emotional exit from a narrative written by Reflex. And Reflex had laughed too early. But Taehyung had spoken at exactly the right moment for truth to land unarmed, unedited, and unforgettable. The real fallout wouldn't be measured in applause or hashtags. It would be measured in legacy, the quiet kind that arrives months later when analysis has turned into acceptance, and acceptance has turned into emotional precedent for millions of idols who still sit in silence waiting for someone to ask them the question late night fears most. The next morning didn't wait for permission to arrive. New York sunlight poured into the suite like a verdict no one had requested, but everyone silently needed. The city was still cold, but the air felt less accusatory, almost neutral, like winter had agreed to pause its commentary for a moment. Taehyung woke before the rest of them, not out of intention, but instinct. Instinct is what survives after performance shuts down. He sat at the small, round dining table, one leg folded under him, the same posture millions of fans would recognize instantly, except this time, no cameras were present to translate his mood into a product. The coffee in front of him steamed quietly. Steam is honest. It rises without exaggeration. He liked that. Namjoon eventually walked out, hair slightly disheveled, holding his own cup. You're up early, he said. Taehyung nodded without looking tired or triumphant. Just aware. Early is where consequences become quiet enough to analyze. Late night is where they explode. I wanted to meet them before they exploded again. Jungkook appeared next, scrolling his phone immediately, then stopping himself, remembering the oxygen rule: drama dies when it's ignored. The articles were still spreading, but the tone had shifted. Instead of mockery or scandal, analysts were now trying to diagnose impact, categorize stillness, and quantify emotional ownership, something the media has no metric for, but desperately tries to invent one for anyway. Jimin sat across from them, eyes still half in sleep, half in analysis. So Taehyung said, leaning slightly forward, "Do you know why the comeback hit harder than the laughter?" They both shook their heads slightly, waiting. Because laughter is a reaction. A comeback is a declaration. Reactions are borrowed. Declarations are owned. Hobai finally wandered out, rubbing his eyes. "The world is dissecting you like a thesis," he muttered. Taehyung smiled once, not offended, not flattered, just unsurprised. Theses don't fear truth. They fear uncontrollable conclusions. Tonight I gave them a conclusion they couldn't pre-write. He paused, sipping coffee again. Coffee is an American confession booth. Everyone talks around it eventually. "The truth is this," he continued, eyes finally lifting. "When Jimmy laughed, he was protecting the show from silence. When I answered, I was protecting myself from translation. The world is used to idols who let emotion be subtitled by others. They weren't ready for an idol who subtitles himself without melodrama." Namjoon leaned back, letting the insight land without interruption. That was another power move, not grabbing narrative control but refusing narrative compression. Taehyung nodded. Compression makes moments trend faster. Decompression makes moments last longer. Jimin finally exhaled, the kind of exhale that admits he understood earlier but waited for Taehyung to say it anyway. "And now?" Jimin asked. Taehyung leaned back into his chair again. "Now, we let silence finish its sentence." Silence had more to say than laughter ever did, and for the first time the world is listening long enough to hear the end of it. Outside, the city honked, rushed, performed its own chaos. But Taehyung wasn't performing chaos anymore. He was observing it like a man who had finally exited the emotional editing bay. The rest of the world could keep laughing, analyzing, debating, trending, and rewriting clips. But no one could rewrite the ownership of a comeback that had never asked for volume, only space to exist without subtitles written by fear. And that morning, under New York sunlight, and without broadcast interpretation, Taehyung realized the legacy of truth isn't written by the loudest person in the room. It's written by the person who makes the room forget to breathe long enough for honesty to finish speaking. The city kept moving, but the narrative had shifted lanes entirely. Not a U-turn, not a pause, but a merge, like a high-speed highway suddenly acknowledging that one of its cars was not following the map anymore. Taehyung was not chasing virality, but virality was now chasing him, tripping over itself trying to explain a moment that had no script and no apology attached to it. When honesty arrives without dramatization, media loses its auto-cue and starts narrating like an audience instead of a conductor. The producers from NBC had sent a small follow-up team, not for broadcast, not for damage control, but for context, because networks know that context is the only currency that can stabilize a global moment they failed to pre-write. The meeting was set in a minimalist conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Manhattan like a silent witness that had signed an emotional NDA of its own. The chairs were gray, the table was white, the room was calm, and calm rooms are where truth negotiates best. Taehyung arrived in a simple black coat, no entourage, no performance posture, no theatrical silence, just presence. Presence doesn't need theatrics, it needs ownership. Fallon was already there, arms open slightly, coffee in hand again, because in America, coffee is the handshake before meaning is signed. "I didn't bring you here to rewrite what happened," Fallon said immediately. "I brought you here so no one else tries to rewrite you." Taehyung nodded once, sitting down gently, coat still on because comfort is honesty's posture. "You laughed," Taehyung said, leaning slightly forward because the show needed rhythm. I replied because the moment needed gravity. Neither was wrong, but one was early. The other was necessary. The NBC lead producer, a woman who had spent her entire career engineering tone for unpredictable celebrities, finally spoke. We want to understand the emotional architecture of your stillness. Taehyung smiled faintly. Architecture can be measured. Humanity can't. My stillness wasn't architecture. It was permission. The kind no idol gets handed by TV. The kind you steal back gently. Fallon laughed again, but this time quietly, like a man who finally understood the assignment. And you stole it elegantly, he said. Elegance is what happens when truth doesn't ask for volume, Taehyung replied. It asks for survival. The room stayed silent for a second again, but this silence was contractual, deliberate, respectful. The producer nodded slowly. This changes how Western TV handles K-pop idols, she said quietly. Taehyung shrugged gently. Let it change how Western TV handles humans. K-pop idols are humans first. Television keeps forgetting that until someone makes it inconvenient to forget. Jimin, who had entered quietly halfway through the meeting and stood leaning against the wall like a man auditing emotional honesty, finally smirked. Inconvenient is your new brand now, he said softly. Taehyung shook his head gently. No. Inconvenient to silence is the brand, not inconvenient to exist. The producer typed something into her tablet. No dramatization, no headlines, just documentation. Truth doesn't need trending words when it has documentation. And documentation was exactly what Taehyung wanted the world to inherit from the moment Fallon laughed too soon. Outside, the city kept performing chaos. But inside the room, Taehyung had already rewritten the emotional edit without rewriting himself again. And that was the difference between being the headline and being the precedent. One fades in a week. The other lasts a generation.